Right, thank you everyone for joining us today for this alumni session on the ambidexterity of fashion houses, myth or reality. Our speaker today is Mitaali Katoch. She's currently pursuing her doctoral studies at Oxford Brookes. Her research topic is survival learnings as reflected in the use of strategy by a centenary family-run luxury fashion company facing disruption. She's also an alumnus of the Royal College of Art, and she's managing director of development and a shareholder of a multi-business unit holding company based in London and New York, specializing in arts, culture, media, and technology industry investments. So if I now just hand you over to Mitaali and she can let you know a bit more about her topic.
Thank you very much, Crystal. And thank you, everyone. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for spending your lunch hour with me. And those of you joining from the Eastern time zone, a very good morning to you. And thank you for spending your breakfast hour with me. I promise to offer something to everyone on this call. So business and management researchers, this would be a window into an exploratory study where we could perhaps learn new ways of functioning from the creative industry. Design researchers, visual culture, art history experts, and fashion enthusiasts. It may be an interesting case and rich visual imagery to nourish your souls. And for filmmakers, a new format into the conception of academic talk using means of production. Colleagues joining in from other departments and my own cohort, I welcome you to my world of looking at fashion through the lens of business and management frameworks. You may be wondering where I am. The experience you're about to have was shot in London. It was a London-based studio, so a huge thank you to my colleague who organized this. This image was taken by me during that time. And I share it with you here to invite you to this space virtually. This talk is about 35 minutes, so let's get right into it. I'm going to switch off my camera for a few seconds and I'll see you on the other side.
My tickets were booked. It was a week before my flight in March 2020 when the pandemic hit. I was at home just like everyone on this call at that point of time. I was frustrated and calling the airline to postpone my ticket. Of course, no one would pick up. Outside of personal catastrophes, I think this was the first time I faced crisis in this manner. There was a community even while we were all locked up in our homes. And long behold, Fashion Week came and I saw a unique approach to holding the show, despite the disruption that had hit us pretty hard. Prada creatively used digital media without compromising on the quality of how collection may be viewed. Dior created a mini haute couture show. Balmain had screens for the audience. And others thought to live stream their shows. So suddenly, what required special tickets, long queues to gain access was available to everyone worldwide through just a few simple clicks. Discussion about disruption and innovation was most popular topic at that time in the fashion industry. I was doing my master's in research at that time, and I launched a research into the phenomenon of disruption, where I observed how fashion companies propose solutions to disruptive change. At the same time, when I reviewed the literature within business and management on disruption, Disruptive Innovation by Clayton Christensen, and Foundational Arguments for the Phenomenon of Disruptive Innovation posed by Charles O'Reilly and Michael Tushman appeared. Interestingly, these remain largely unexplored within the fashion industry, and it was certainly not explored in the context of a heritage luxury fashion house. Fashion companies have survived disruption for a very, very long time. So could these companies have a way of facing disruptive change in a way different from the tools proposed by business and management researchers? The fashion company of Dior was founded in 1946. It has been shown to manage continuity and border shocks from different forms of disruption in the post-war era. Today, it stands as a multinational luxury fashion company with LVMH as a majority shareholder. It seemingly powers through any kind of existential challenges with ease. And you can see this. Their financial report shows a trend of continued growth. So what is the underlying story behind their success? How do they achieve continuity? Do they have a balanced regime of exploitation and a serial originality simultaneously? The financial picture signals successful continuance despite the disruption. There must be something more than meets the eye. So let's look at some literature that I examine. When examining terms like disruption within business management literature, here's what came up. Some of you may already be familiar with this literature. So it all begins with Clayton Christensen's paper on disruptive technologies. In 1995, he defines disruptive technology. What is that? So these were underperforming established products in the mainstream market that had a few fringe customers who valued their offering. These were disruptive because they'd shown to precipitate the failure of leading firms. After he wrote this paper, he furthered his work and found another phenomenon at play that described why these disruptive technologies led to the failure of leading firms. This was published in 1997. So he shared this to be due to something called innovator's dilemma, whereby the very management practices which allow companies to become industry leaders also make it extremely difficult for them to develop disruptive technologies that ultimately steal their markets. So this paper was focused on technological companies such as IBM, Apple, Xerox. At that time, I came across another book, and this one was called Lead and Disrupt. Of course, I picked it up because it had the term disruption or disrupt in it, and that may have been relevant. So after examining this work more carefully, I found that a few key occurrences were unfolding in parallel to Christensen's work on innovator's dilemma. This parallel development is related to the development of ambidexterity within organization studies. So let's look a little bit closer into what ambidexterity is. Ambidexterity is the ability of an organization to both explore and exploit. Explore activities focus on new tech, new business models, flexibility, autonomy, experimentation. And exploit activities, as we know, are geared towards attaining efficiency, control, incremental improvement. There were various forms of ambidexterity that developed over time. And this image shows so. So different types of ambidexterity. So we start with sequential, where explore activities were followed by exploit activities. The next one is the one that is the main focus and something that connected the book. Simultaneous ambidexterity, which Charles O'Reilly and Michael Tushman wrote about in 1996, where both explore and exploit activities occur in balance simultaneously within an organization. Then we saw contextual ambidexterity that enabled individuals to decide for themselves between explore and exploit activities. So for this research, I found that there was a link between simultaneous ambidexterity in 1996 and Christensen Innovator's Dilemma in 97. So how do these two connect? Tushman O'Reilly devised simultaneous ambidexterity as a solution to Innovator's Dilemma. This was completely serendipitous. Their 1996 research was then published in 2016 in a book which was called Lead and Disrupt. So this was a full circle moment, which I'd randomly come across. Another interesting bit was that in that same year, a few scholars aimed to understand ambidexterity in a project context and how it can be enabled and enacted. This drew my attention as the paper shared ways in which the act of exploration and exploitation in an organization could be manifested in a day-to-day project context. So before this particular phenomenon of ambidexterity was only thought about in a firm level. And the scholars that were talking about project-based ambidexterity, they were trying to find ways in which they can articulate this process for managers on a day-to-day basis. So here's the framework. The framework was defined through 5 managerial actions from their paper, namely buffering, gap filling, integration, role expansion, and tone setting, and 3 types of intellectual capital underlying resource utilized, and their interdynamics. So this was human, social, and project capital. The paper, which was authored by Turner and other colleagues of his, clarified ways in which companies could contend with disruptive change at the scale of a project. And in turn, this may amount to significant organizational shift, helping it to thrive in a rapidly changing environment. So I wondered if examining a fashion company through this framework could reveal whether it actually functioned in an ambidextrous way, the subject of today's talk. Is fashion ambidextrous? Is it a myth or a reality? So in my case, in this research, I took the case study of Dior, and it was an interesting case to examine. And it was so because in his autobiography, Christian Dior states the dichotomy that still exists in fashion. And in my perspective, also within other creative industries, creativity and business don't necessarily see eye to eye. And I could see that from his autobiography. There was this one quote, which I thought was really interesting. He recounted, he said, "First of all, I should have to meet famous Marcel Boussac, head of the Comptoir L'Industrie Cantonnière, which alone seemed an unsurmountable obstacle to someone as shy as me. But that was not all. I should have to deal with the host of businessmen who knew nothing about couture, and the very word business, with its sinister implications, had always terrified me." So we can already see that even when Dior started his firm, there was always this tension between the creative side and the business side. So further developments within the brand made it an interesting case to examine. In 2011, the creative director of Dior, John Galliano, was dismissed for making a politically incorrect remark. And we quickly saw LVMH shift gears with their strategy to contain Dior's reputational damage. And not only that, to recast its image as a progressive organization. In 2012, they launched a new fashion collection, introducing it to a wider world by financing and producing a behind-the-scenes documentary about the creative process. This was released in 2015, and it was called Dior and I. So Raf Simons, a then budding Belgian designer, was recruited to reshape the season's offerings and recast the Parisian house's perceived stodginess. The new strategic direction was manifested indeed and communicated to the world through the strategic release of now, as we all know, the critically acclaimed documentary film project, Dior and I. So, of course, Dior was an interesting context to examine. But why a singular case study? A singular case exploration focused on a singular artifact, providing key chronological organized insights that otherwise may have been overlooked in larger studies like the ones attempted in the past. So I used this documentary as my case study. The 90-minute documentary delivered a rich audiovisual constructed narrative data, prompting and facilitating critical scholarship. So this documentary film allowed social science researchers to get a glimpse of chronologically stitched behind-the-scenes footage. It portrayed both process of creating a couture collection and its impact on key stakeholders within the company management. The film showcased an 8-week process of assembling a couture collection by newly appointed creative director Ralph Simmons. So I put forth that film is a valuable tool for contemplating variable answers to the proposed investigation. Implicit in all this is, of course, the pressing macro level issues within fashion business. These are showcased against internal dynamics with ambidextrous management of collections production, vividly portrayed as a clear response to disruptive innovation. So let's quickly review the trailer of the documentary used as a case study.
Fashion says that it can be somebody completely different. My Dior is my Dior, is my Dior, is my Dior.
Je voulais dire la bienvenue à Raph.
Raph wasn't the obvious candidate. People said, oh, he's a minimalist.
I feel very humbled to stand here.
I find the legacy of Dior rather challenging.
Ouh là 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 là.
La plus ancienne de l'atelier. Combien d'années?
Ah oui.
42. 42.
Wow. Couture, c'est nouveau pour moi.
On va l'aider.
Oh, on va se régaler.
I have an idea, but it's very extreme.
Il y a du velours?
I want it to be dynamic because I find women very dynamic.
How fast can they make a jacket like that in black?
Oh non! Alors tout va être prêt demain?
Bah ouais.
Il est bloqué.
Je repars à zéro.
Pas tellement.
There was not one dress here, not one.
When you have a big stage, you step up. It asks you to do more.
I never give up until the first girl is on stage.
It's gonna look like Versailles. It's insane.
Il y en a, c'est dans l'alcool, moi, c'est dans les bonbons.
I hope it's gonna look good. Stand by pour musique.
The documentary film presents the observation of the unfolding process of ideation and creation of a couture collection. And it includes recording of direct interviews with company stakeholders and the clear points of friction in accomplishing efficiency, control, incremental improvement, all things that fall within exploit, and flexibility, autonomy, experimentation, all things that fall under explore characteristics within ambidexterity. This research observes similarities between the production of a couture collection and a project. A collection in the fashion industry may be a project, that's my hunch. And similar to a project, a couture collection is a unique occurrence. There's no collection before or after that adopts the same approach. And it has a beginning, middle, and end. Some of you may be wondering if a documentary is an appropriate form of case study. Well, my research has shown that social science research has used film as a data collection tool since the early 1900s. And the validity of using documentary film as a rigorous data collection tool is vigorously debated, of course. So while this debate still exists, postmodern thinking and the rapid development of visual technologies provide opposing views, making this a viable source of data collection. In conducting the work, I acknowledge the existing challenges to researchers as they consider documentary films like Dior and I as viable data sources. The use of film in researching business and management is an underdeveloped resource for developing theories. Management research has in fact highlighted previously problematic ways scholars have used film in an unbiased representation. And this is probably why researchers are not inclined to use this approach when theorizing, because scholars are using this as unbiased representation in ways to find proof of what is going on in an organization. I put forward the notion that the value of this platform lies in its credibility in summarizing interactions that otherwise would remain hidden from public and scholarly communities. So instead of finding the truth, I adopt an interpretivist approach to the apparent transparency of film, with the stance of not explaining human behavior, but just understanding it. And this research aims to identify the fingerprints of ambidexterity in the context of a luxury fashion company, where access to behind-the-scene action is privileged and often made opaque. So this may be a good point to share the phases of the research. So phase 1, the work began by analyzing the documentary film using frame analysis. This initial analysis and its underlying assumptions were checked by reviewing the film with a London-based director and cinematographer specializing in fashion media. He had not seen the documentary film before, and he provided a fresh perspective in the assembly of the film. So the semi-structured interview with the director of the documentary film also helped in evaluating the level of scripted content within the documentary. He mentioned how the content was captured. There were parts that were scripted, of course, but those were clear inserts portrayed in Dior's voice, drawing parallels with the unfolding scenario with Raf of making the couture collection and the experience of Dior back then. Next, a conceptual framework was derived from the seminal paper that outlined the characteristics of enabling and enacting ambidexterity in a project context. We already talked about this previously when I mentioned Turner and his colleagues working on project-based ambidexterity. So in phase 2, the documentary film was analyzed thematically. And the themes were derived from characteristics of project-based ambidexterity. The characteristics were, as you can see in this image, managerial actions and intellectual capital and its interdynamics. The managerial actions were analyzed by tally and the frequency of each occurrence. And the characteristics of intellectual capital and its interdynamics were analyzed based on the skills of the team building the couture collection. So let's look at some data analysis now, and let's look at some examples of buffering, where the manager acts as a barrier to prevent unwarranted distractions from affecting the team. So in this case, Raf Simons, the creative director, may be considered a manager, along with his right-hand man, Peter Mullier. So we had 2 such instances of buffering, and this was the setting up of the space, setting up the studio space. And how so? He would say things like, I will work in the studio with the design team, but this is a permanent laboratorium. Or in another setting, which was where there would be management of unwarranted distractions with like soft edges through dialogue. For instance, he would say, how much time before the show do we finish the collection? This is a way for him to say, this is new to me, this is not something I've done before. And I just want to understand, because before this, Raf actually worked in ready-to-wear. And this is his first couture collection. Then, interestingly, there's another occurrence, and I mentioned tone setting before. There's a combination of buffering and tone setting happening at the same time. And buffering where he sort of manages unwarranted distractions, but then tone setting where he's saying this couture is new to me. In ready-to-wear, there's more time. He's implying that there's more time to finish the collection before the runway. Whereas in this scenario, people are stitching till the last minute before somebody goes on stage. The next thing I looked at was gap filling, and there were several instances of gap filling, which is the managerial requirement to ensure that all tasks are in fact performed. And here, Peter Mullier was really important, and there were 3 such instances where his presence actually made sure that the process was moving along. It was in instances like Raf wanted to know if he could see everything at the fitting so that he can try combinations. And the response of the person stitching is not everything is going to be ready. But again, Peter Mullier just said, well, but we can start, right? So it's in a way to kind of just keep the process going, keep it all moving to ensure that all tasks are in fact performed. There was another occurrence like, will everything be ready tomorrow? No, it's not going to be ready tomorrow. So we will do the fitting tomorrow. It's just that RAF wants to see everything. So it's constantly sort of pushing to make sure that everything is in alignment. And then you have a third occurrence, which is in order to fulfill the majority of the collection for the fitting, Raf Simons, right man again, Peter Mullier gives priorities to Premier Florence. So next, the characteristics of integration were observed, and there were about 14 times that this sort of was observed across the process. And what is integration? These are instances where the manager brings together disparate knowledge within the project. So him looking at art and getting inspiration from art. So he visits Centre Pompidou and he says, there is not one day when I'm not looking at art. And he spots the sterling ruby and appreciates the colors. And actually, he ends up using that particular print. He prints it on textile, and he uses that in the couture collection. So that is some of the ways in which Raf uses his experience within other realms that he has had in the past, but in this case, in building this particular collection. Another one is because he's so in tune with developing ready-to-wear collection that, you know, he has techniques that maybe others in his position won't. For instance, there was a prototyping exercise that happens, and they're prototyping a white jacket and they're converting that into a black jacket. And his question is like, how fast can they make a jacket in black? And it's going to take a long time. So instead, he just spray paints the white jacket just to see how it's going to look, because this is not the final product. These are just initial draft clothes that he's making. So yeah, so there are these interesting occurrences within integration. He's combining disparate knowledge from his past experience. Another interesting one, I think, that really impacted this particular collection was using the idea of Jeff Koons' flower puppy.
I think. Do you know the Jeff Koons flower puppy? Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah. Yep. Everything inside is flower. Everything. You walk in and it's all flower. Everything. But it's genius, huh? So you walk from one space to the other, and one space is like all white orchids, and then the next one is all pink roses, and then the next one is multicolored. And the smell.
That could be amazing. Amazing.
Nice, no? It's just like the kind of the negative of the Jeff Koons puppy.
So all of these ideas are him bringing his experience from another realm, but into building an haute couture collection. So the next thing was tone setting. So 6 instances of tone setting were observed, which can be observed. So what is tone setting? It's the instance where manager sets the exploitative and exploratory ethos for the project. So how did this happen? We have a few instances here. So it's things like when Raf sets the limit by 12 overarching concepts. Then the team then starts sketching and producing about 150 to 200 sketches, and then Raf picks 3 or 4 sketches out of those. That's one instance. Another instance is like Raf sets the ethos by stating how he wants to have the same effect of warp printing, but with sterling ruby artwork. And he insists on inkjet printing. So these are ideas that Dior otherwise, in a very traditional context, would not do. So we observe the managerial actions. So how can these be plotted? This is the image. And in this image, you can see that the case study, which the framework was based in this diagram, was an IT context. This is how these managerial characteristics were represented. We see in this image, we see an overlap of managerial actions. We see role expansion with tone setting, buffering with gap filling, and all of them share characteristic integration, but this is in an IT context. it also showcases two aspects: point-based ambidexterity, where it's the one in which one individual is a significant actor in creating project-based exploration. And then there's distributed ambidexterity, where multiple people are in charge, essentially. In Dior's context, Ralph Simmons was key in developing the project. So there was more point-based ambidexterity instead of the distributed one. We see an overlap between the characteristics of integration and tone setting alone. Instead of integration, overlapping with all other managerial practices, like in the IT diagram. We also see that gap filling has no overlap with any other managerial practices. Another point is that you'll see point ambidexterity existing instead of both distributed ambidexterity and point ambidexterity in the case of IT. In fashion, only point ambidexterity existed because Raf was the only key individual developing project-based ambidexterity. Perhaps there's something different in the way fashion goes about doing its managerial practices in this context. So let's now examine the intellectual capital and its interdynamics and how it was exhibited in the film. So as you recall, these were the themes that I examined: human, social, and project capital. We'll start with human capital. So human capital can be further subdivided into generalist and specialist. So let's examine the criteria for the generalist archetype. So generalist archetype, one of the criteria is that human capital is positioned in multiple knowledge domains. And Ralph Simmons, I think, aligns more with the generalist human capital characteristic. Why? Because his training began with industrial design. He worked as a furniture designer for galleries and private interior spaces. Then he worked on the presentation and decoration of showrooms and collections during his internship at the Belgian fashion designer Walter van Beirendonck. He began his own fashion label for menswear, head the fashion department at University of Applied Arts, Vienna, and worked as a designer for Jill Sanders. So now let's examine the criteria for the specialist archetype. And the first criteria within that is that human capital embodies domain-specific knowledge and often incurs with a functional bias that may reduce the willingness and ability of individuals to exchange and combine knowledge beyond their specialized area. So as we know that Ralph Simmons was more of a generalist, not a specialist, because he did combine knowledge from different domains coming together. So similar to human capital, now we switch to social capital. Social capital also has two specific configurations that align with exploitation and exploration. And these are cooperative and entrepreneurial archetypes. So characteristics of cooperative archetypes: it is characterized by a tightly coupled social system consisting of strong and dense network connections, a generalized or institutional trust-based membership in the social unit, and shared knowledge of how knowledge can be combined. So 2012 may have been early in Ralph Simmons' professional career in comparison to an outfit like Dior, which is ages old. So Dior may align more with this archetype than Ralph Simmons. However, this stands outside of the scope of this research as it speaks to an organization level. And here we're only talking and focusing on the project level. So let's come back to the social capital archetype. And one of the characteristics of it was an entrepreneurial archetype. This is described as a more loosely connected social system consisting of weak, non-redundant relational networks, resilient dyadic trust developed through direct personal experiences, and common component knowledge that reflects shared technical, professional, and operational knowledge. So through publicly available information, RAF may be more aligned with this archetype. It may be gathered that Ralph Simmons' connections grew from his internship with fashion designer Walter van Beirendonck, his alliance with stylist Olivier Rizzo, artist Willy van der Perre, and fashion designer Veronique Branquinho. and was through casual social gatherings with Royal Academy of Antwerp as students. So he developed that sort of network there.
Ralph wasn't the obvious candidate. People said, oh, he's a minimalist. You know, would he leave Jill Sander?
You have two sweet soup and fruit.
And also people didn't know who Ralph was. I mean, you have to remember, the people who really know about Ralph are the people who covered menswear and who saw his shows in 1995, 96, 97, 98. It was the beginning of the real revival of the skinny black suit.
While he did grow in prominence between 95 and 2012, his connections may have been only within menswear. So we can see that Ralph is more of an entrepreneurial persona instead of the cooperative archetype. So now let's look at project capital. Project capital, what is it? It's the existing organizational level intellectual capital, together with the formal and informal processes that operate within the project's boundary. So it also consists of two aspects aligning with exploration and exploitation, which is organic and mechanistic organizational capital. So we can see this in the diagram here. The organic approach includes informal processes, and mechanistic approach includes the measure of methods, procedures, routines, explicit knowledge, and formal processes. So we see here that Dior is more mechanical than organic. So how do we then take this data, and what comes off this is combining all this data, I got to the following. And you'll see from this graphical representation, this is what the intellectual capital looked like for this particular case. The diagram depicts that the making of a couture collection does enable and enact project-based ambidexterity. However, the processes are more exploratory. Now, this can be confirmed through the raison d'etre of a runway collection itself, that it's not always created because it'll bring revenue in the company, but often it is created to begin a new trend, a new fashion cycle. So what do we learn from all of this? Is fashion ambidextrous in the way it operates in a company context? Is it a myth or a reality? So from this research, it strongly suggests that ambidexterity is transacted and enabled and enacted in creating a couture collection at Dior. So the project level of making a new collection is not dependent on revenue generation, whereas the firm level activity of servicing existing clients depends on generating revenue. The diagrammatic representation of this friction can be seen in this image. So what is the value of the work? The work's relevance lies in its methodology, which employs strategies for examining the effects of disruptive innovation and project-based ambidexterity, which are applicable to professional management practices within the fashion industry. What is the underlying story behind Dior's success? Could we observe some of these underlying reasons from managerial frameworks, such as project-based ambidexterity? Perhaps. Perhaps the way they operate has helped them achieve continuity. Perhaps fashion companies have their own way of functioning and facing disruptive change. This exploratory study was a way to examine if business and management research could maybe learn from the creative industry. And maybe we can.
Thank you very much for having me, Crystal. I hope you've all enjoyed the session. If there are any sort of questions that you've got, I will let Crystal know for my email, and I would be happy to hear from you guys. Thank you very much, everyone.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Mitaali, for such a great presentation. If you have any, as Mitaali said, if you have any questions, then you can either send them to me or and I can forward them on. But in the meantime, I hope everybody has a lovely afternoon, and thank you again.